Good afternoon everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nissa, and if you are new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. I am currently doing a run of voiceovers and videos all at the same time, releasing them sort of a day apart, but all the filming has been done over many weeks, but I'm only just getting the chance to do the voiceovers and editing of them, so that's what we're doing. So today's video is cowboy candy. So I'm recording these in order, like I'm releasing these in order of when they occurred, because some of these items are going to affect the food prep and meal prep that you see every month. So after my 6-week grocery haul, I always share the prep and preservation and all that of all the food that I buy on the 6-week grocery haul. And some of these things happened just before I left or just as I got back, and I'll use these items in that food prep and preservation stuff. So I need them to come out in order so that you guys aren't looking at things and going, well, when did that happen? And I don't want them to cross over the other way either. So today's video is cowboy candy, which I knew I was going to need with all my food prep and everything that I was going to do. So I had to get done before I started all of that. I do have an older video 12 months or so ago on cowboy candy, because that's probably about how often I try and make it, because it's seasonal. This one, the last batch only lasted, actually I'm not sure. I think the last batch I made only lasted about 6 months, so maybe the filming was from the time before that. But ideally, I want to grow enough jalapenos and chilies and things like that that I can make 12 months worth at a time at the end of each warm season. My garden was pretty abysmal this year, obviously, so a lot of the stuff that I'm using at the moment has come through the fruit and veg shop or through the hampers. So anyway, this is the cowboy candy batch that I made, and we have adapted it as we've gone along to what works for us. So I'll give you all the information about how we change it to work for us and why we do what we do, and then you can decide, what's going to work for you rather than using exactly what I use and that sort of thing. So see how you go anyway. And this is cowboy candy. Alright, so this batch of cowboy candy, I had some frozen minced jalapenos that I'd gotten from the hamper. So there was a bunch of jalapenos and chilies and stuff that I'd got from my food pantry, whatever you want to call it, the hamper that I get every 4 weeks that we pay $50 for. There's a couple of videos showing what we get. And so what I had done one time was I had got a whole lot of extra chilies and jalapenos, and I had minced them all up in the Thermomix and stuck them in Ziploc bags and stuck them in the freezer, because I just did not have time to deal with them right then and there. So what I'm doing is I pulled them out of the freezer the day before so that they would defrost a bit, put them in a container and cover them so that I could do this with them. Now, there's a lot of recipes out there for making pickled jalapenos, sweet pickled jalapenos, cowboy candy, whatever you want to call it. They all use very similar ratios because they need to, because they're a canning recipe, so they have to have certain range of ratios. Some people use it sliced into pieces, some use it into great big chunks. We, generally speaking, use the liquid more than we use the solids. So what we do is we dice up the jalapenos into really nice little small pieces so that it is more of a hot sweet syrup, spicy sweet syrup, with little flecks of peppers in it, rather than being big chunks of those chilies and peppers with a little bit of liquid. But it depends on how you're going to use it. So what I do is I do a fairly large ratio of syrup to solids. So I had about 6 pounds here I did it in pounds because most of the recipes around were in pounds, so I weighed mine to see how many pounds they were to compare to all these different recipes. So I had 6 pounds of diced up jalapenos, and I don't know what that was in kilos, 3 something kilos, and I used that amount. So I used 2 litres of apple cider vinegar with 6 kilos of sugar. Now this is a lot of sugar, but it's going to make a lot of jars. We can it into smaller jars because we only use it, as I said, like as a drizzle syrup. We use it in mayos, in pasta sauces, in that sort of thing, like as a flavour boost to these sorts of things. We don't tend to put it on top of dishes. The Daryl will sometimes drizzle it on top of pizza or something like that, but it's more to be used in cooking than to be used as a finishing item. So a lot of people have it in the slices and the pieces because they're scooping out those solid pieces to eat with their food, and the syrup is just what holds it in the jar. So even though it's a lot of sugar, it's not a lot of it used at a time. Like you might only use a teaspoonful of the syrup into a mayo or into a pasta sauce or something like that. We're not using huge quantities of this syrup at a time in anything that we're making, and we're not eating it straight out of the jar. So for me, it's an okay thing. I'm happy to use this quantity of sugar to get the flavor profile that I'm after. So the first step is to get all your ingredients into a pot and heat it through. So you want to bring it up to a simmer so that all the sugar is dissolved. There's a variety of different recipes out there with a variety of different herbs and spices. Some people use turmeric in it, some people use some mustard seeds. There's a lot of variations. I like to use a little bit of celery salt. You can use celery seed or celery salt. We don't have any celery seed at the moment, so I use the salt, which is fine. So I used a bit of celery salt, about 2 tablespoons for this quantity, and about 5 tablespoons of garlic powder. I probably would have used granulated garlic if I had it, but I don't. I need to do that bulk spice order that I keep on talking about to be able to do that. I only have the powdered garlic currently. So I used about 5 tablespoons of that powdered garlic as my flavor profile for this particular thing. I started on a lower heat. You want to move it around in the bottom of the pan so the sugar doesn't stick. So you want to stir it fairly regularly and pushing the heat up until it comes up to a simmer. Now I'm running into the same problem I have been for ages here, that my pot isn't quite large enough. When sugar boils, it froths and bubbles, and you really want to be using a larger pot than I am here. So if you're making this ratio of the sauce, you definitely want a larger pot. I believe this pot is about 14 litres, and I'm going to invest in the 23 litre one soonish. I just haven't managed it yet, but it's on my list of things to get for myself. Once the sugar syrup is simmering, and you can see here that it's threatening to overflow, you need to either quickly take it off the heat or add something to it that's going to rapidly decrease the temperature, especially if you're using a pot that's too small, a little bit like me. So what I did was I added the jalapeno and chili mix and all the defrosted liquid. Now this is going to be spicy. All that liquid is the frozen and then defrosted liquid from these chilies. So this is really warm. You can smell the heat, like if you lean over and sniff it, then it burns the back of your throat. But you got to remember that I'm only using about 2 parts of solids to 4 to 6 parts of the liquid based on most of those recipes out there. So it's okay because there's going to be a lot of extra liquid to the ratio of jalapenos. So even though these jalapenos are really spicy and there's a lot of them, it's a lot of liquid to go with it too. Once it was all added, I mixed it. Now, I totally know that I'm going to have issues with this quantity. In this pan. I did consider splitting it into 2 pots, but I was using the other burner for something else, and I decided that I would just clean up the mess I'm inevitably going to make later on. So you want to bring that up to a rolling boil, which means even when you were stirring it, it's still bubbling around the spoon rather than the movement of the spoon taking it off the boil. And yes, it did overflow. It made an awfully sticky mess on the paving stones under the stove, but luckily that's what they're there for. So we have these concrete paving stones underneath this camp chef, and the idea is that they can be removed, scrubbed down and put back as needed. So I poured vinegar over them and scrubbed them off and got all the sticky, tacky syrup off them, and it was fine. So after that, we're going to take the majority of the solids out and split it between the jar. I'm reusing mostly pesto jars here. So we buy a lot of these little pesto jars because, again, I didn't have a garden this year and we eat a lot of pesto. The goal is to grow enough spinach at the same time as I can get basil and things like that and make some bulk pestos up this year, but I haven't got there yet. So at the moment we buy pesto, we buy it in like 12 jars at a time from Aldi each 6 weeks. So I've got lots of these little pesto jars. I also have some 240ml or 4-ounce jars as well because I have a lot of them as well because they're a good size for this sort of thing. I'm going to reuse some of the pesto jar lids that are in good condition as well as use some brand new lids. So I'm going to use a bit of both. I basically just put 1 big scoop of the solids off the top of the pot into each jar. I started with about 26 jars. I've been aiming to can things in 6-monthly lots at the moment because I haven't been growing my own. So we were saying before that I'd like to do 12 months, but I'd like to grow enough for 12 months, can it sort of thing. I haven't been growing, so I've been using what I can purchase. So 6 months is a really good goal for that. So I try 26 jars is a jar a week. So, that's a minimum sort of thing that I want to do of most things that I'm making. My friend Nicole and I had discussed these stainless steel pourers for pancakes and stuff that I'd seen used for canning jams. When I'd discussed it with her, she found some for sale that were cheaper if you bought 2 of them, so she said, hey, I'll grab them. And I'd totally forgotten that she was grabbing them. And then when I went down to Brisbane last, she gave me one for my birthday, along with a lovely little card wallet that I'd been saying I'd been looking for as well, which is really nice to get gifts of stuff that you've wanted but haven't bought yourself, and to get them instead. It was lovely. So it works really, really great. It only has a narrow pouring spout, and the jars were already pretty messy because I did the solids first. But for jam, like if you were doing a jelly with this would be perfect. I used a ladle to fill the container over the pot and then used it to fill the jars. You couldn't have too many larger bits in the mix, as I said, because the opening is quite small, but it was perfect for this. Once the larger solids were removed, the only thing were the seeds that were left behind, and they just stuck to the side of the funnel anyway. So it was really, really easy to use, and so much easier than a funnel. It was much easier on my hands, not having to do that tilt movement to pour like a ladle over jars. Being able to just use both hands and squeeze the trigger on this was really good. And it comes with a little stand, so that's great. Though I do need to put a little bowl at the bottom of the stand because I put it in the stand and it dripped sticky stuff all over the bench. But hey, that's why I have stainless steel benches. So I ended up filling quite a few more jars as I went, and some had next to no solids and it was just liquid. But again, that's fine because that's what we use the most of, is the liquid. We use it in cooking, so the liquid only is perfectly fine. I also filled a really big quart jar with a whole bunch of the liquid because I have a bunch of chicken to marinate, and I'm planning on making sausages next week and things like that, and I tend to use Cowboy candy in my marinade for my chicken, but also in the marinade for the pork sausage mince as well. So I thought I'd just fill a quart jar with it to use over that period of time. You are supposed to leave the jars to mellow for a couple of weeks on the shelf before you use them, and it definitely does take the vinegar flavor down a little bit, but for marinating and things like that, then it doesn't really matter. So that way I could put that in the fridge to use for these sort of things, rather than filling more little jars and then having to open multiples of those little jars over the next couple of weeks while doing this bulk food. Once the jars were full, I cleaned the rim super carefully. Now you want to be really careful because you've got all that sticky residue and the chance of tiny little bits of minced chili, so you want to make sure that they're super clean. Plenty of white vinegar. Rotate the cloth to a new spot really regularly and get them really nice and clean. You don't want any little bits of syrup or chili to impact the seal of your jars. Of course, if a jar doesn't seal, this sort of a product you can stick in the fridge and it'll last for weeks, but that's not the point. You're going to the effort of canning it, you want it to work, or that's how I feel anyway. I used new lids on the 4-ounce or 240ml jars and a mix of the new and old on the pesto jars. I'd washed the jars and the lids in warm water prior to use, and I also wiped the inside of the lids out with a bit of vinegar as well, just so I could double check them, make sure there was no dust or debris in them, as they'd been in the container after they were cleaned, after they were used. So like when they've come off the jars originally, they've been cleaned, put in a container. But yeah, I like to double check all these things because we live in a dusty, dirty sort of an environment. A lot of things are open to the weather, so I always like to clean the insides of lids as well before I use them in canning projects. I used my big buffalo canner. I put a rack in the bottom and then put a full layer of jars, put another rack on, and then filled that layer as well. I did end up putting a few more on the bottom layer than shown here because I just wanted to distribute things a little bit better. So when I started filling the top layer, I decided I'd put a few more in the bottom layer as well. You don't want any excess room here because you don't want the jars to tip over while they're canning. They will seal if they tip over, but it's not optimal. Optimally, you want all the jars nice and neatly standing up to go. Because I had plenty to fit in there, I just readjusted them so that they had a sort of an even amount on the bottom and the top. I filled the pot with warm water. The jars are warm, so you want to use warm water. I used a bucket from our shower. So for us, our main hot water supply is in the bathroom. When we do dishes and stuff, we fill buckets and fill it at the sink. We have cold water that runs to the sinks, but we don't have hot water that runs to the sinks. So we could do, and we did at one point, but it just went through too much gas because every time you turn the tap on it would tick the pilot light on. So you'd go through the batteries on the pilot light and the gas when you don't really need hot water at the sinks most of the time. So we just fill a bucket in the shower and use that in the sinks and kettles of water if we need to as well. And so because the jars are warm, I got a bucket of water from the shower as well to use into the canner. So you want about a 1.5 inch amount of water over the jars to allow for evaporation and for the movement of the water to not impact that the jars are being submerged. You want the jars to stay submerged for the whole canning process. I put the lid on top, but I didn't lock it. I just placed it on top, and that will help the water come up to a boil quicker, but also helps reduce evaporation as well. Now, I am above 1,000 feet altitude, so I have to can these for 15 minutes, but they get canned for 10 minutes for under 1,000 feet. So it is 15 minutes if it's a short canning project, it is 10 minutes for under 1,000 feet and 15 minutes for up to 6,000 feet. If it's a 40 minutes and over canning at a base level, then it's longer than that, I think. I can't remember, but generally speaking, for something that's like jams and things like that, there are 10-minute processing for under 1,000 feet, 15 minutes for 1,000 to 6,000. So I get it to a full rolling boil, start the timer, 15 minutes. Once that 15 minutes is up, I turn the water off and the burner off and let it sit for 5 minutes just to settle. Then removed all the jars out onto a board to rest for 24 hours undisturbed. So after that 24 hours, we wipe them all down, we label them. Not that these ones really need much labeling, it's pretty obvious what they are, but we do anyway. Label them, check the seals, wipe them down to make sure that there's nothing sticky on them, because if you've got a bit of sticky on them and you put them on the shelf, then you're going to attract ants and things like that. You're going to have the potential for mold to form on the outside of the jars, and for rodents and insects and things like that to invade the outside of the jars to, eat any of that residue. So giving them a wipe down is a really good idea. Warm soapy water, a bit of vinegar, whatever tickles your fancy there. It depends on who's doing it for me as to how they get cleaned, but they get cleaned, labelled, and put onto the shelf. So as I said, that is normally left for a couple of weeks to mellow, and that's to do with the pickling. The apple cider vinegar, it will mellow a little bit. It will be a little less acidic if you let it sit for a while. But because of the way that we use this, it's not a massive issue for us, because like for marinades and things like that. But because I did leave out that quart size amount, I probably won't need to open another one of these for a couple of weeks anyway, because we'll use that quart jar up and then we'll open the other ones later. So I think I ended up with, I want to say 32 jars maybe, plus the quart jar, so heaps, which was great. And I did end up with some jars without solids in them. I'd probably I've now got a record of how many that made, and I would probably try and split those solids up a little bit more between the jars. Even the ones that only had liquid still had the seeds floating on top, so they've still got a little bit of texture to them. And it's basically a spicy simple syrup, isn't it? But it's not water, it's vinegar. So I don't know. This is the way we like it. So as I said, a lot of people cut it into chunks and they have the chunks in there, and what they're doing is they're scooping the chunks out to put on things. They like the chunks of chili. We're not a huge fans of those. We did that the first time, we sliced them up, and mind you, it's very time consuming to slice them up too. And then the next time I diced them using one of the little flip dicer things that you can buy, the little green and white flip dicer things, and it works wonderfully. But again, it was pretty time consuming, and there were still some decent sized chunks in there that were unnecessary for the way we use it. So like if we're using it in a mayo, it gets blended with the immersion blender anyway and gets down into a fine whoosh. We do use it in the pesto pasta that I make all the time. I put a drizzle into that, especially one for Daryl and I, not always for the kids. And sometimes when you get a big chunk of the chili in that, it's a little bit jarring because it's just not really the way we eat it. We do definitely like the flavour of it. The flavour of it is amazing, but we do prefer it to be more pureed than not. So all I did was throw all of them take the tops off them. I didn't take seeds out or anything, and threw them all into the Thermomix and pureed them up into a minced texture, and that's what I was using to make it this time. So there is variables as to the shape and size of the pieces that you want, and that's going to vary the amount of jars you get too, because of the size of the pieces and how many jars it's going to fill around it. And then whether you want the jars full of solids with just a little bit of syrup, or if you just want a few solids floating on top with the syrup sort of thing. But that's why you have to cook the chilies in the syrup, because then it's going to flavour the whole thing. So you want it at a rolling boil for a little bit of time and a simmer for a little bit of time, and that to flavour that whole syrup. And it's amazing how well that syrup, even though it's only been boiling for 5 minutes, how well that syrup takes on the flavour of the chilies as well. So it's one of our favourite condiments. The caramelised onion paste jam that I made the other day, that's another one. That and the Cowboy candy. What else do we make a lot of that the they're two of the biggest condiments. Like apple butter barbecue and plum barbecue are huge ones for the kids, but Daryl and I aren't as big a fans of sauces like that as the kids are. But the Cowboy candy and the caramelized onion jam add so much flavour to so many things that it's what we really enjoy having on the shelf. So anyway, that was Cowboy candy, and it is definitely something you should try, even if you don't think you like chilies and peppers and stuff, because I'm not a huge fan, to be honest, and I don't really like I like warm food, but I don't like the heat to I like the flavour of the food to come through, so I don't eat a lot of chili dishes and things like that, though I have changed my tastes a little bit, but so I wasn't sure I would like this, but we really do, so it's definitely one to give a go, even if you think that maybe it wouldn't be something that you'd like. It's one that I would recommend trying, just a small batch, not 30 odd jars like I made, but just a small batch. Alrighty guys, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for joining me again.